Welcome to Disposable Society, where we sift through the societal landfill of social institutions and public attitudes and belief systems about people with disabilities, addressing the garbage stereotypes and discrimination and picking out the treasures of advocacy and progress. My name is Caitlin, and together we will be diving into all topics disability. Nothing is off limits. If there's a topic you want me to discuss, leave a comment below. I'm starting this as part of a journey to garner support in my own community at Indiana University, South Bend. Hopefully, this leads to implementing a comprehensive course on disability. Please show your support by liking and subscribing and clicking all the bells and buttons. Future episodes won't be as long as today's. Don't be holding me accountable though, because I'm not sure. But probably not, as today we are talking about more historical context. Before each episode, I will describe my appearance for those who are visually impaired. So today I'm just wearing a gray t-shirt and I have long dark brown hair and it's down. I have bangs. They're a little too long. They're almost covering my eyes, so I just swoosh them to the side. And in the background, I've got some plants. I've got a mannequin wearing a sweater that I crocheted myself. I'm very proud of that sweater. It has an eyeball on it. Above the mannequin, who I named Jack, I'm personifying him, I'm calling him who, or saying who, but is a neon sign that's in the silhouette of a head, and where the brain would be, it says open, to insinuate open-mindedness. So I've done previous, more in-depth research on accessible community art spaces as alternatives to medical model art therapy for individuals with physical disabilities, as well as research on the hierarchization of race through disabling immigrants and eugenics rhetoric within immigration policy. The latter research touched on the alarming language that the current administration uses that mirrors eugenics rhetoric from the past. It was written in April of this year, before even more eugenics rhetoric has come out over the summer. I hope to apply many of the topics I cover to current events. Today, we are talking about some key players in the canon of disability studies as well as accessibility. I do have a physical disability, a birth injury called Erb's palsy that affects the nerves connected to the upper region of the spinal cord. I have very limited mobility in my right arm, and it is visually smaller than my left arm. And she just does her own thing sometimes. Sometimes my disability is very visible, and other times, like sitting in a classroom or walking past someone who isn't looking too closely at how it swings or its size, it could be classified as invisible in those situations. It has very much impacted the way I show up in the world and how society approaches me. And I'll apply my experiences as I can. But enough about me. Let's talk about us. We shall overcome. We'll walk hand in hand. We shall live in peace. We are not afraid. The whole wide world around. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We Shall Overcome by Pete Seeger echoed the streets of San Francisco in 1977 as a group of disabled activists sat in a federal building for 26 days, peacefully demanding federal civil rights protection as outlined in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act be enforced. The Public Act brought social prestige to the disability community and got the ball rolling for more 504 regulations to be signed and the eventual creation of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. The protesters, led by prominent disability activist Judy Heumann, ended their protest by changing the chorus of Pete Seeger's song to "We Have Overcome," a monumental display of pride and power for the disability community. 2 years later, "We will ride, we will ride, we will ride," was being shouted in the streets by a group of activists who came to be known as the Gang of 19. They shouted in protest for 24 hours as they penned 2 buses. With their bodies and wheelchairs blocking a Denver intersection in protest of inaccessible public transit buses, they used their bodies, those that had been stripped of agency and value by our society as arbiters of power. At this point, public transit was a unicorn. There was no transit for a population whose members largely exist below, at, or slightly above the poverty line. People who likely cannot afford their own mode of transportation. In 2020, the National Council on Disabilities Progress Report on National Disability Policy, Increasing Disability Employment, found that people with disabilities account for 29.4% of Americans making less than $20,000 a year, and 22.7% of Americans making between $20,000 and $35,000 per year. And at the time, the Gang of 19 protest on July 5, 1978, no legal requirements existed outside of Section 504, which was just beginning to be enforced, for accessible public transit. But this landmark protest resulted in 250 buses being fitted with wheelchair lifts and was also the origin of the Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, or ADAPT. After this research, I was interested in finding out what public transportation in South Bend has to offer its disability community. I found a few interesting things of note for you friends. The public transit system in South Bend is called Transpo, and it is highly accessible, containing buses fitted with ramps, kneelers, stop announcements, drivers who receive specialized training, and a paratransit service called Access. Transpo has a fixed route system that covers South Bend and Mishawaka and offers reduced fares for elderly, Medicare holders, and people with disabilities. To be eligible to receive reduced fares or paratransit, you must complete an application that is available on their website. Access is complimentary to those unable to use Transpo who are deemed eligible. I will include their phone number and website in the description below. So these pioneers of disability advocacy not only set the stage for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, it also paved the way for groups of scholars fighting for representation in universities, in body politics, and in the literary canon. Disability as a study really began gaining momentum in the 90s, following the passing of the ADA. Some noteworthy canonical literary academics that I'll be talking about are Leonard Davis, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Christopher Bell. So Leonard Davis is a professor at the University of Illinois, and while he does not have a disability himself, he did grow up in a deaf household where sign language was used. His book, Enforcing Normalcy, was written in 1995 and is clearly motivated by this experience. In the introduction of the book, he shifts traditional framing of disability, using the term temporary abled to describe what is often just referred to as able-bodied. This is a term I am definitely going to steal throughout the rest of my days. It quickly sums up the ephemeral nature of able-bodiedness. It is precarious, fleeting, so respect your future destiny. Now, some may say, oh, that's cruel to wish upon anyone or to stoke fear, and to that I say, disability is not awful, and it is nothing to fear. It is part of the natural progression of life. Yes, it is challenging, sometimes physically painful. Some days are emotional and mental torture. But disability is part of life, and most everyone will be disabled if they live long enough. Davis challenges the reader to look at disability as a moment in time. The absence of hearing, for example, can be seen as a temporary moment that all humans experience in various moments. He's trying to show to his reader that many activities, like reading a text, does not require the act of hearing. Linguistic minorities, what he says many deaf people prefer to be called, so linguistic minorities, may be better suited to accomplish tasks that hearers could not. Davis comes from an English literature background and does a great job exploring disabled stereotypes that are exhausted by the literary canon, and how elite power structures have captured language and the canon and used them to propagate norms. Where we hear about the male gaze or the female gaze, he talks about the eugenics gaze. Some of his most fundamental work can be found in the Disability Studies Reader, edited by Davis, which came out with its first edition in 2013 and is really foundational in disability studies. The first chapter finds Davis questioning the origin of normalcy. The word normal originally meant perpendicular, with its root norm being a noun that was the name of a carpenter's square. It did not come to be known for the meaning it carries today until 1840. Ideals preceded norms, dating from the 17th century, when intellectuals and artists were captured by the ideal body as depicted by many variations of Venus. Greek artists, Zeuxis, selected ideal body parts of women in Croatia to composite the ideal woman, as represented by Aphrodite. People have always been inclined to compare themselves with one another, but norms have not always existed. Statistics further push the acceptance of norms as desirable, even necessary, for one to fit into the social contract. Adolphe Quetelet, French statistician, applied a law from astronomers called the law of error to human features to construct his concept of the average man. He wrote, "Deviations more or less great from the mean have constituted, for artists, ugliness in body as well as vice, in morals, and a state of sickness with regard to the constitution." So we see this early linking of physicality with morality, which becomes a through line in history and in politics, weaponized still to this day. Take a look.
To every college president, I say remove the encampments immediately, vanquish the radicals, and take back our campuses for all of the normal students who want a safe place from which to learn.
Out of this theory came the bell curve, which has the standards centralized in the graph, and the extremities and deviations on the outskirts of the standards. People with disabilities and other marginalized people fall on these outskirts and are therefore deviants. These ideas gain momentum, and with the adulteration of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and radical thinkers, scientific racism and eugenics ideals were slowly and steadily nudged into American society through a process of desensitization that began with accepting that there were norms, applying this idea to physiology, and then theorizing that humans could and should breed for these ideal traits. Eugenics originated in America, which many people are surprised to find out, and the man who coined the term eugenics, Francis Galton, was actually Charles Darwin's cousin. It became publicly mainstreamed in America and Europe before it was ever adopted by Nazi Germany. Eugenics is such an extensive dialect, it seems like a disservice to leave you with just a scratch of the surface, but I'm linking my Substack below where I will be publishing both research papers that go into much more detail if you are interested. I will also be publishing transcripts of each episode, including works cited at the bottom of the page. These will be a little rough and ready, but I want to make them accessible for anyone who might need or want them. But moving on, one of the drafters of the ADA, Robert Bergdorf, said, "An underlying goal of most traditional civil rights standards is often to treat everybody identically, without regard to race, ethnicity, sex, etc. With disability, however, although there is certainly a strong objective of treating people with disabilities the way others are treated, there also needs to be a recognition that particular individuals with disabilities may not be able to do certain things, or that to do them in the same way that other people do, and that treating everyone identically in the assumption that everyone is the same can actually be an act of discrimination." This statement is salient with Davis's outcries of the damage that normalcy has caused society. "All I wanted my entire childhood was to be normal. The thought of being found out was devastating. I hid my arm with long sleeve shirts. I pretended like it didn't exist. Completely convinced myself at some points. I identify with Rosemary Garland Thompson in this way. She has identified as having a birth injury like me, and she didn't acknowledge herself as disabled and really only started to understand her body and experience as a disabled person in graduate school. Academically, she is credited for having established the field of feminist disability studies by publishing about disability in feminist journals. Her canonical work, Extraordinary Bodies, was written in 1997 and explores a historical pendulum swing of public perception of individuals with birth defects as, quote, marvels at certain points and as, quote, monsters at others. In stone carvings, for example, they were depicted as marvelous wonders. The Greeks, however, depicted them as monsters. In the 7th century BC, the tablets at Nineveh described 62 congenital disabilities and their religious meanings. Various philosophers had something to say about birth injuries. Pliny saw congenital disabilities as proof of natural abundance. Augustine perceived unique bodies as the gods' constant intervention to let us know they're there. In the Middle Ages, a monster was considered a prodigy. And the 16th and 17th centuries saw marvelous narratives in the form of English chapter books, wonder books, and roadside freak shows. Thompson explains that physical disabilities went through a process of infrequent, with the introduction of freak shows in American culture. These shows began at a time when America was sculpting its identity and trying to distance itself from the class system of Europe. Those in power wanted to give the illusion of freedom to Americans, but immigration policies and freak shows were a covert way of implementing order and expectation, creating a social hierarchy based on race and ability, and creating a narrative of immorality and criminality about people who don't fit the correct categories. Barnum, of circus fame, put on freak shows beginning in 1835 when he trafficked a black, old, toothless, blind, crippled slave woman named Joyce Heth and presented her as an exhibit, an example of America's composite other. There were many disabled people trafficked and put on displays as freaks during the 19th and early 20th century. Some were sold for their body parts post-mortem, showcased as embalmed bodies in profitable tours nationwide. The American shows were gone by 1940. Scientists had officially created the term birth defects, and congenital disabilities were newly framed as medical issues. The medical institution became increasingly elite over time, creating their own classifications of physical norms, using BMI and other measurement instruments. In the age of Freudian psychoanalysis, new bounds were laid out for psychological norms and deviance as well. It may be surprising to find out that disability studies, even with a centralized focus on inclusion and civil rights, had been absent of non-white voices in its canonical formation. Christopher Bell called out the nascent lack of black voices and voices of people of color in his 2006 essay, Introducing White Disability Studies, A Modest Proposal. This essay was published in Davis's second edition of the Disability Studies Reader, and there is still more need for diverse races, sexes, and genders in conversation with disability. Political and social theorist Antonio Gramsci promoted a concept called philosophy of praxis that I want to openly adopt through this process. The idea is that in a program of study, like disability studies, that promotes the inclusion of voices of a subjugated group of people, scholars teaching and discussing the topic need to admit the shortcomings and contradictions of the program in order to make true progress. I want to have an open forum of discussion about phrasing and language, because I'm definitely going to get it wrong. But for me, talking about the barriers facing people with disabilities is more important than being afraid to speak. There's enough fear-mongering in our society right now already. It's exhausting. The truth is, I internalized many ableist beliefs just by being a member of the society that pushes normalcy so hard. Normalcy is discussed in such a flippant way, like it is an obvious truth. The disillusionment that norms exist is more harmful than any book that is being banned or any protest that is being broken up by military bodies. We'll see more implications of normalization next week when we discuss healthcare for people with disabilities. Until next time, upcycle what you can.